And let's move on to the next talk. That's going to be by Josh Dillon, who is joining us from California, from Berkeley, who's going to be talking about the first upper limits from HERA on the 21 centimeter power spectrum. Take it away, Josh.
Thank you, Pascal, and thank you to the other organizers for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on this little early in the morning in California. So I'm going to be talking about HERA, the Hydrogen Epoch of Reionization Array, and our first upper limits, which are now in referee review and have received a favorable first report. So for those who haven't talked much about 21 centimeter cosmology, we're of course interested in studying reionization like everyone else here, but we're looking at it from a slightly different lens. So we're looking at the relative brightness temperature of the 21 centimeter line compared to the cosmic microwave background, and that's probing the physics of the intergalactic medium. So it's probing the overdensity of hydrogen, it's probing the spin temperature of hydrogen, which tells us about the spin temperature of the gas, the baryons in general, and of course the neutral for hydrogen. So we're learning about the reionization by directly probing the gas that is, of course, reionized. So there's been a number of experiments, and I'll mentioning just a few here, who have slowly brought down the upper limits toward the sort of roughly what we think is a theoretical level on the power spectrum of the fluctuations of this 21 centimeter signal to a variety of measurements across redshift and spatial scale, and of course, over the last better part of a decade now, as people have learned how to do these kinds of experiments. But I want to talk about HERA, the Hydrogen Epoch of Reionization Array, which I should mention is a collaboration of institutions led by Berkeley, but across the world. And so I'm presenting the work of not just myself, but a large number of people, especially some graduate students who have done some really great work on producing this first upper limit that I'll be talking about in a minute. And I should acknowledge that we're funded by the NSF and the Foundation, to whom we are quite grateful. So how do we actually measure the 21 centimeter power spectrum? And I want to go through a very rough overview of some of the steps that are involved. So the first first step, and the one I spend a lot of time personally working on, is calibration. And the challenge of 21 centimeter cosmology is that we're looking for hydrogen out here in the early universe, but between us and the epoch of reionization is, of course, everything else, more or less, and especially our galaxy and other galaxies that are emitting synchrotron radio foregrounds that are something like 4 or 5 orders of magnitude stronger than the signal we're looking for. And the key to separating the two is that the 21 centimeter signal is probing different redshifts are probing different parts of the universe, so we're seeing a very spectrally complicated signal compared to the synchrotron foregrounds, which are intrinsically quite smooth. And so as long as we can maintain that separability, that smoothness in the instrumental response, we can separate the two. So one of the ways in which you can lose that separability is calibration. So the visibilities, which is the radio interferometric quantity we measure, is not just what's actually on the sky here, but it's multiplied by a complex frequency-dependent gain on every individual antenna in our array, and these antennas can be quite complicated things, so we have to understand that to some extent. And the way that HERA was designed, which is this highly redundant configuration, is that we're using the same pairs of antennas, which is to say the same physical separations on the ground, which measures the same Fourier mode on the sky effectively in interferometry. And so we're using that highly redundant information to solve for all of these gains simultaneously. So just as a little bit of example of how this works, these are what we call waterfalls. So it's time on the y-axis and frequency on the x-axis. And these are all supposed to be the same physical separation on the ground. We're looking at the phase because the visibility is a complex quantity. And of course, they're not. So we'll throw away this antenna number 50, which never worked. And then we impose this constraint that they have to be measuring the same thing. And all of a sudden, they really do look like they're measuring more or less the same thing. So that's what's letting us, for example, integrate down. So here's a single visibility a single day, and now we're adding up 18 days together, and it looks like the noise just comes down, which is great. So now we move to the second step, and that was a very quick overview, which is specifically to look at some of the systematics. So as we're integrating down, one thing that we found was that while we have these foregrounds, which are living at, we call K parallel, the Fourier modes along the line of sight, around 0, there's these systematics that are dominating here at higher K, which is the region of Fourier space that we'd like to be able to see our signal. So in work led by Nick Kern, who also did a lot of the work on this power spectrum upper limit, who was a graduate student at Berkeley and now is a Papalardo fellow at MIT, he looked at how to model these systematics. So one of the ways to understand the systematics is to, instead of looking at them in Fourier space, so this is the Fourier transform of frequency as delay versus the time that we're looking at, instead to Fourier transform time as well. And now there's actually a clear separation between the kind of systematics that are living at higher K or higher delay up here. Turns out that they're also at what we call fringe rate zero, which is say they're not changing in time. And so that temporal separation turns out to be quite useful for distinguishing, for getting rid of systematics that are a problem. So just using those techniques based on that idea, we're able to get back down to roughly the thermal noise limit everywhere except where the foregrounds are dominating, which of course, that's what we expect to have happen. So down here, these are modes we'll probably not be able to measure, but out here, this is where we have a much better chance. So next, we want to actually go and measure the power spectrum. So this is about just binning up all these different baselines, all the different times, and eventually here we have an example of one of our deepest power spectra, which is what we then use to set the upper limits and try to say what we can about the universe. So we're measuring, of course, our power spectra. We have a whole process for estimating our error bars and our window functions as one does in cosmology. But the exciting thing to me is that when we start, with our first attempt to get onto the big board, so to speak, we're down here. We have now the world's leading upper limit on the 21 centimeter power spectrum. Hopefully this will be published relatively soon, or available on the archive is relatively soon, since we've had already one favorable referee report. And so we will have in hopefully the best published upper limit on the 21 centimeter power spectrum. But of course, we're still a ways away from the signal we're looking for, so we want to keep pushing toward that. And I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. But before we were comfortable publishing something, we wanted to also go through and do sort of an end-to-end validation of the work we've been doing. So one way to do that, of course, is to try to simulate everything that we think we're observing into the various effects that go into our measurements. So this was a work that was led by a number of folks, including, I wanted to highlight a graduate student who's now at McGill, but was a junior specialist at Berkeley, Bobby Pasqua, who really led the work on simulating a lot of these different effects. And we wanted to test the most important real world effects, especially these cross coupling that I just talked about, the thing that is separable in time, cable reflections, which is literally the signal bounces up and down these coax cables, and that can create high spectral structure systematic, for example. And when you put it all together, these things can be quite difficult to distinguish from the EOR. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to compare what the EOR looks like in this space to all of these systematics. And what's nice, I think, is that this is really starting to look like what the real data looks like. There's a lot of clear similarities to what we're doing. So this was another work led by James Aguirre to show that we could actually validate and all of the analysis that we did on the 21 centimeter in order to get to our power spectrum upper limits. And things are looking pretty good. So here we see, for example, power spectra that are complete. This is all completely simulated data, but with the real analysis pipeline that we used. Our foregrounds are up here. Our detections of EOR are matching in the gray line here, the input power spectrum, the input 21 centimeter power spectrum, and then we have our noise dominated region. So it looks like there's a significant region of Fourier space where if the signal were substantially larger than it actually probably is, we would have been able to detect it, and we would have detected it in a relatively unbiased way. So we are able to also quantify those biases, which raise our limits a little bit. But that was a very valuable part of this whole analysis, the whole validation process, which was to build confidence that the techniques we're using to separate this very small signal from overwhelming foregrounds was actually working. And so lastly, we want to actually interpret the information that we have. So there's a large team within the collaboration who are more traditional theorists who are trying to compare our upper limits to what they say about our models. So as one particular example that I think is quite nice, one thing that we can more or less rule out, though I wouldn't say 100% rule out at this point, is that the intergalactic medium was unheated. So we believe that the intergalactic medium was heated at redshift 7.9. And probably heated by X-rays from either high-mass X-ray binaries or supernova remnants. We're not able to distinguish between those models per se, and I don't think this is a big surprise to anyone that the intergalactic medium is heated at this redshift, but this is something that you can go and say something about with a 21 centimeter signal because of this term here. If it's unheated, then the T-spin is going to follow the temperature of baryons, which are adiabatically cooling since the time of the last scattering surface. And if they are so cold that they're substantially colder than the cosmic microwave background itself, then this term can be large and negative, which makes the power spectrum of this quantity large and positive, which we would have seen. So we can rule at least out that model and say something physically about the universe, which is something that is relatively new to our field since we've been slowly pushing down toward the region of interest. But we are also going through it and building up the full MCMC machinery. So I don't want to dwell on any particular plot because I don't think that our limits are really changing our understanding of reionization that much at this point. But a lot of this was just practice. So this is work in an upcoming paper that's still in preparation, where we're going to go, turn the crank and go through the full analysis and really see what can we learn about the universe from these measurements, so that when we have more sensitive measurements, we'll be able to say more about the astrophysics of reionization and the cosmic dawn and the first stars and so forth. So what's next? Well, first we have 94 nights of HERA that are still waiting in the can. So here's a number of nights bin together versus, and this was the analysis we did just that I was presenting, our internal data release 2, and here's internal data release 3 that I'm personally leading the analysis of. And so that should increase our sensitivity. We'll have more fields, more parts of the sky because we're just a drift scan instrument, and of course a lot more sensitivity. So I think we'll be able to put much more sensitive limits on the power spectrum, probably by a factor of a few. And we also have some data from our phase 2 instrument, which is what we're observing with now. And there we've upgraded the feeds to observe not from 100 megahertz to 200 megahertz, which is redshift 6 to 12 roughly, but actually up to redshift something like 25, though that's going to be quite challenging. We have a much wider bandwidth. So this is the kind of sensitivity, sort of best case that we might see with, although I think we'll do a bit worse than this, and we really probably won't be able to detect a 21 centimeter signal. Here's a couple of different scenarios, including one with a very strong radio background to explain the putative edges detection at redshift 17. But with the full HERA and the full range of redshifts, we should be, if edges is true, we should be able to see it easily. And even if it's not true, there's still a lot of astrophysics to do, both at the reionization redshifts and here at more cosmic dawn redshifts. So to sum up, I'll say that we, of course, have a first and world-leading upper limit on the 21 centimeter power spectrum. There's a lot of sensitivity left to go, and this is allowing us to now do theoretical interpretation. But to my mind, the most important thing is everything that came into this, the work on calibration, on validation, on the power spectrum estimation and systematics mitigation, that have been a huge collaboration effort, is really what is going to underlie future analyses and allow us to move forward in the field. So with that, I thank you guys for your attention and be happy to take some questions.
And thank you, Josh. I'll ask a brief one while we're waiting for people to type. What is the timeline for that previous plot you showed about when you could detect or rule out the edges detection?
Right. So going back a couple slides here, actually, let me go back one more, which is we are still commissioning this system. And so we're still trying to understand some of the new systematics that come with building, effectively replacing almost everything. As a bit of background, HERA was built on the same site as PAPER, one of the predecessor instruments, and we actually used a lot of the same components. And now we're basically replacing all of the parts that are PAPER, and the only thing that's really left are these dishes, these 14-meter dishes sitting out in the middle of the desert made of PVC pipe and telephone poles and chicken wire mesh. So I think we're still a year or two away from being able to publish something that will start to impinge on what EDGES has to say. I think the data we have in the can now, given our limited access to site with COVID and the large number of antennas that are just not working, we probably won't have the sensitivity of the data in the can right now. But I think next season, our observing season is usually the southern summer, when the galaxy and the sun are down at the same time, should be plenty of sensitivity to say something about edges. And then the question is, how fast can we go from having data to writing papers? And that's always a challenge.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we have another question. this upper limit, that is it? The question is it due to insufficient instrumental sensitivity, which I guess it is, or is there a possible non-optimal calibration strategy, or can you improve that even further to push it down?
Yeah, so we started with a relatively manageable set of data. We're talking about 18 nights, but it's still hundreds of gigabytes on disk, and so just cranking through all of that was we were not necessarily looking to get the absolute most sensitivity we could out of the data we had in the measurement, and that's kind of what we're thinking with this third internal data release, which has substantially more nights. So we are mostly limited by sensitivity, but there still are a few residual systematics. We're seeing, if I go back to the power spectrum itself, actually, I'm sorry. Let me go back a few. The power spectrum itself, there are things that look like low sensitivity detections. We are not claiming that this is a detection of anything astrophysical. It's probably systematics. And some of these are, detected at a few sigma. So there will be more systematics that we'll have to continue to understand in terms of making sure that our instrument is spectrally smooth in its response, and it's not taking these 10 to the 5 times stronger foregrounds and making them look like signal.
Okay, thank you very much.